Welcome everybody to the second and last presentation that I have for this camp meeting. We'll open with a silent prayer. Amen. In our presentation yesterday, I responded to some questions that some members had asked me. And I got some feedback from that presentation. And I'm hoping that those who didn't respond found the answers useful. At the last presentation that I did on, I think it's the 31st of December last year, I made a number of comments that I just want to give some clarification about. I think it was either at that camp meeting or a previous one that I'd made a comment about what happens to Levites when they join this movement. I've responded to that query on the media broadcast some time ago now. So I'm not going to address it now, but I wanted to just put it into the public domain that I've responded to that query already. Another question that has surfaced related to the issue of the relationship between Levites and priests. And we could make the same argument about Nethinims. In connection with both Matthew 13 and Daniel 2. And we have an experience which has developed into a habit to take multiple lines of history and lay them one on top of the other. So we could take the history of ancient Israel at the beginning, which we tend to call the alpha history. And then we might lay that over the top of the beginning of modern Israel, which would also be the alpha history. And we can do the same with the Omega history of ancient Israel, the history of Christ, and the Omega history that we're currently living in now. So the comment that I want to make is the following. Because we're so familiar with laying line upon line or history over history, what we can get into the habit of doing is the following. We'll take one story, one prophecy, one parable, story, prophecy, parable, take a second one and say that these two stories both point to the end of the world, and therefore we can overlay them. I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. But what I am suggesting is sometimes the way it's done can get you into trouble, can lead to problems. You can end up making mistakes. And part of the reason that these mistakes can occur is part of what I've been discussing since last September. It's the relationship, or we might say the tension, between the individual and the corporate. So individual priests and corporate Levites, or individual Levites and corporate priests. And the word corporate means a group. I want to be careful how we use the word institution. Which we may discuss at a future time. So, because I have done this numerous times, spoken about Daniel 2 and Matthew 13, both definitely speaking about the end of the world, both having a similar storyline, those of us who use parabolic methodology can be lulled into a sense of false security. Lulled means deceived. So what can happen is we can say that they're identical stories, and therefore the symbology is also identical. But we all know that there are subtle differences between those two stories. And I don't want to suggest it's as simple as the following. Because people think that Daniel 2 is a broad, sweeping overview but Matthew 13 would be a detailed version of the same story. Without saying it too strongly, I'm going to, so don't hold it against me, I'm going to say that that is not correct. What I would rather suggest is the following. I won't draw it on the board because I think you all remember. In previous presentations, I've taken an object and it often was a cylinder like this. This is a pen cap. And it's the same object, but if you look at it from different perspectives, it looks different. So if you go from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions, you get completely different answers. One answer is a rectangle, and one is a circle. In the same way, these stories, even though they're the same story, are teaching different things. So in Matthew 13, when it speaks about the field, it says that there are 2 groups in that field. So what you have to determine, and which I'm not presenting a study on this now, but I'm making an observation. So you have to decide what is what in each of those stories. What symbol is equivalent in each of those stories. Is the stone the field? And if so, does the stone contain many stones? I want to suggest that is a dangerous methodology to go down. When we start adding information into a parable, if it's not done correctly, we can get into big problems very quickly. And if the 2 groups are the mountain and the stone, then what is the field in Daniel 2? So what happens is if you try to force fit these 2 stories together, if you're observant, you get into problems. If you're not observant, you end up making mistakes. As I say, this is not a study on those two prophecies, those two stories, but it's an observation. In Daniel 2, if the stone is a representation of the final work of God's church, and it appears to be, because the stone turns into a mountain, replacing the original mountain, then in Daniel 2, it doesn't indicate that there are two stones, two groups of stones, two types of stones, just one. There's no bad stone anywhere. But if you go into Matthew 13, it's a different story. The parable teaches that the plants are us, are human. Two types of humans. One, the children of God, and one, the children of Satan. So what we need to be careful is when we approach these stories, when you do line upon line, which you're supposed to do, that it must be done carefully, because it's all too easy to assume something and then make a mistake without realizing it. And this is one of the reasons why I've been laboring the point for several months now regarding the subject of who and what Levites are. And whether we should be considering Levites as individual people or Levites as a group. And when we do that, how do we dovetail or fit that model into these prophetic stories? We should be exerting our energies to do this work. It's your job to do that. So I'm not trying to discourage you by saying the following. It's a lot harder than you think to do that. And you need to be really careful how you approach these studies, because most of us, many of us, some of us will end up making mistakes. And I say that with a level of humility, not suggesting that I have all the answers. So another point that I want to clarify was about how we teach. And I think many people have misunderstood the point that I was making in the December 31st study that I did. I've tried to study with individual members, with teachers, to try to expand and to give more context and detail of what I was trying to say. And those conversations have led me to be able to, I hope, simplify and clarify the point that I want to bring across to you. So there were a significant number of people that thought I said the following: it's fine to expand upon or add to the midnight crime message. That I was somehow giving new instruction or new direction. And whatever you may have heard me say or thought I said, or thought that I meant, what I want to say is that is wrong. I never gave teachers in this movement the license to go ahead and teach their own material. I have never believed, and I still don't believe, that that is what teachers in this movement should be doing. If you go back to the Omega of ancient Israel, to the Alpha of modern Israel, both of those histories show us clearly that people weren't teaching their own material. They were copying and replicating the message of the angel, of the messenger, whoever that was. And this should not be new to us. We should all know that. There were 300 1843 charts, 300 1850 charts. And there was a command or an unspoken one that said everybody teaches the same material. So what I want us to remember is a short phrase. This is what I meant. It's about quality, not content. And many people have taken away from that statement that I made that I was referring to content, whereas what I was referring to was quality. And quality doesn't just mean good or bad in that sense. because we should all be doing a quality work within our sphere of capacity. We all have different talents. But I want us to remember the phrase, quality, not content. But I want to now change the word quality to style. And if you can think about the following idea, it's about the purpose of why you are teaching. Because if you're teaching in the same identical style as, I will now refer to the person as the messenger, whoever that is, what I'm saying is you're doing something wrong. Because if you're going to copy them and be identical to them, you don't need to be there. You can just hand over that material to your audience. So if you copy them and you do it in an identical fashion, then all you need to do is just send them the video or photocopy the material and just pass it on. You don't need to do anything. The point I was making is that teachers in this movement don't seem to understand their job. They know they're supposed to teach, but they don't know how to teach. Once again, this is not a new concept. I spoke yesterday about not training, but discipling. Discipling is not disciplining. I don't know how it translates in different languages, but they're not the same thing. I want to really clarify that. A disciple is a person, discipling is what you do to that person. It's the difference between the noun and the verb. So I'm hoping that all the translators in their own language understand that concept. So I don't want to spend too much time with this issue. So I've made it clear that the point I wanted to make was not dealing with content, it was dealing with quality, or what I've referred to as style. When it does come to content, there is a definite need to expand or to define things in a better way than the messenger has done, or in a different way that makes sense to the teacher. Sometimes the messenger may make a mistake and that gets picked up and that should be corrected. If you don't like mistakes and correction, then at least qualified. So when I talk about style, one of the things I've mentioned is the difference between linear teaching and spiral teaching. There's a definite technique to educating people that most of us who are teachers are not doing well. So when it comes to style, not content, you need to choose your mentor carefully. And I'm suggesting that often what we tend to do is gravitate to the messenger, the angel, and because we're supposed to copy their content, we assume we should copy their style. The point I was making in that presentation was I don't think that's a good way to approach your craft, your job. Because your job function is different to the job function of an angel. The end goal is different. We have made strenuous efforts to stop group baptismal classes. And we have insisted that they go from group studies to individual one-on-one studies. People think the reason for that is because individuals don't get sufficient time. They don't get sufficient attention. That's true, but it goes much deeper. What ends up happening when you do group sessions, group teaching, is you end up copying the style that the messenger uses to do their group studies. And I'm suggesting that's not the most effective way to educate people. So this is not a training session, but it's a clarification of what I was referring to. And in your teaching pools, you should know other teachers. You should be coming together and working out how to teach more effectively. And without attempting to be rude, you need to stop making your presentations boring. And they become boring when you replicate the style of the angel, the messenger. which should not be taken as a criticism of their teaching style. Because the person that I'm critiquing is the teachers in the movement, not the messengers, not the first or the third angel. They have done their work well. It's the rest of us that have not and are not doing our job well. So it's not content, it's quality. And when we talk about quality, we're talking about the style of teaching, that we should not replicate the first and third angel. We should develop a different style because our job function is different. So as always happens, in my attempt to clarify, I normally make things more confusing or more complicated. But I'm sure that with discussion between yourselves, you'll be able to understand more clearly what I'm referring to. Over the last few months, we have skirted around the subject of Acts 27. And even though I've referred to it several times, we haven't really discussed any aspects of the study. So it's not my purpose, it's not my work to reinvent that study. In English, we say reinvent the wheel. But I wanted to make some observations. I wanted to give some thoughts that I have about that subject. So in our study yesterday, a question was asked about meditation and yoga. And I made the comment that there are people who would worship a tree stump or a rock, and there were others that would worship or pray to the true God. So they're completely different gods, but the purpose of their prayer, their adoration, is the same. The point I was making yesterday was a different point to the one I'm making now. But yesterday's question and my answer serves as a good introduction to this thought. So yesterday, it was about the benefit that those two individuals receive. And I argued the point that the person who worships the tree stump receives more benefit than the person who prays to the true God. Please refer to that study, that conversation that we had, to understand the point that I was making and why I was making that point. So in Acts 27, I'll put it this way in a very simplistic fashion. You will get two people, they're two groups, and they are both praying to the same God. Just like in the example yesterday, you pray to the tree or to the rock. And let's be intelligent, not foolish. Each of us knows that these people are not really praying to rocks or trees. They're not that immature. They're not that foolish. They may bow down to a rock, but they are not praying to a rock. They're not praying to a piece of wood, thinking that piece of wood can do something for them. And if you think that there is something strange about them, bowing down in front of some wood, then ask yourself the question, what were ancient Israel instructed to do? They too were asked, commanded, if you like, to bow down in front of a piece of wood. With some metal inside it. You can quickly see that there aren't very many differences between those two systems of worship. So when that person is worshipping or bowing down to a rock, to a tree, you know what they're really doing? They're worshipping or praying to the God who is represented by those items, those things. They're worshipping or praying to the God of nature. And we all know that nature is one of the lesson books of God, the true God. And one of the arguments that God makes against Job against the 144,000 is, where were you, where was Job when God created nature, this planet. It's not the purpose of that argument that God makes, but God identifies themselves, as the God of nature. When we speak about the creator God, the creation is nature. So the point I'm making is that both groups, those who pray to a tree stump and those who pray to the living God, are both praying to the same God, the God of nature. I'm not trying to say that they are literally the same God. I'm saying that they're the same God in the sense that they have rulership over the same thing. In the mind of the individual. So in Acts 27, you get two groups of people that are both praying to the same God. And what I mean by the same God, the God that has the same title. Who rules over the same kingdom. And what is the kingdom that God has rulership over in that story? So we all know the answer to that. The kingdom is the sea. They're both praying to the God who rules over the sea god. So in another story, in another setting, that would be Dagon. But that has nothing to do with this story. So there are two gods that are going to be worshipped, but they are both ruling over the same territory in the mind of the person who is worshipping them. So we're familiar with the story that they leave Caesarea and they go through certain ports. They go to Sidon, Myra, Cnidus. Cnidus. So those are the first three ports that they go through. I just need a 2-minute break, if you don't mind. There are two groups of people. They're both worshipping the god that rules the sea. The story begins in Caesarea. They take a ship and they go first to Sidon, then to Myra, and they stop there. They swap ships. Then they move on to Cnidus. And if you're familiar with the story, they get a problem with the weather. It's not the right time for sailing. And instead of the western winds that would take them to their journey, the wind switches and comes from the north, from the Aegean Sea. And that prevents them, if you're familiar with a map of the Mediterranean, for going over the top of Crete. The direct route is to go from Cnidus over the top of Crete and then go towards Italy. But there's no good route that way. So as you read in the story, they have to go underneath Crete, south of Crete. And if you looked at the geography of Crete, there aren't very good ports or harbors on the north side of Crete compared to the south. So on the very eastern tip, they cross the peninsula called Salome. And they arrive at a protective harbor or port, which we all know is called Fair Havens. The name tells you what it's there for. And it's at that place where things begin to go wrong. You know that they don't want to stay there because it's not comfortable. They leave, and then they get hit by that wind that is coming off the mountains of Crete. There's winds there that drives them into the sea, and they get hit with Euroclydon. So they make mistakes at many junctions of this story. When they change ships at Myra from the ship of Adramyttium to the ship of Alexandria, and then the Alexandrian ship goes on to Cnidus, they should have stopped there. Or they could have continued with the ship of Admiritium and have gone there, which is further north in the Aegean Sea. As winter was approaching, it was normal for people to go to Italy via the land route. Up through Ephesus, onto Philippi, and then on to Rome. But they didn't want to do that, so they remain on the boat and they make this mistake because they're forced to go south of Crete, not north of Crete. And then they get hit by that wind. And so all of this is happening on the south and southwest coastline of Crete. They leave the eastern tip of Crete, which is Phoenix, which we would call today, and in the Bible it's called Phoenice. But they get blown by this wind and their plan doesn't work. And then they get forced to go south or under an island which is on the southwestern tip of Crete called Clauda. The name of the island is Clauda or Claudia. And then they're driven all the way to Malta, where the shipwreck occurs. And that's that 14-day period that's spoken in Acts 27:27. So I just want to read a verse if I can find it. So we're in Acts 27, verse 40. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea and loosed the rudder bands and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward the shore. And I want to pick up the little phrase in that verse. It says they committed themselves unto the sea. So I know in the literal sense, it's saying they just let the sea do whatever it was going to do. They had made their calculations of what was going to happen. So they've put anchors at the back of the boat, and now it's pointing towards the shore. They have let go of the rudder, which is the steering mechanism, and let the sea do whatever it's going to do. And they put up the sail, so the wind that is headed or pointing or blowing to the shore is going to send them crashing into the coast. The verse before, verse 39, says, if it were possible to thrust in the ship, which means to crash it on the beach. So verse 40, they're going to take up the anchors, they're going to let go of the steering wheel, put up the sail, that's three things, the anchor, the steering wheel, and the sail, and they're going to allow the sea to drive them and crash into the beach. Now, we could argue that this was all technique. And it is. But I want to suggest right there that both groups are putting their faith, their lives into the hands of their gods. They both worship the God that controls the sea. And what they're doing now, when they're committing themselves to the sea, is not just saying, we know how the sea works. They're saying, we will trust ourselves that God, who controls the sea, will guide and protect us. Parabolically, all 276 people are doing this, praying to their God. Committing themselves to the God who controls the sea, whose fate is in God's destiny. Remember, Paul's already told them before that the God of the sea, his God, has told him that no one will die. That's verse 34. You'll notice in verse 35 that he prays for all 276 people. So you see that this, I'll call them the second group, are wavering in their faith. Because they accept that prayer. Verse 36, they're all happy and they all eat. But in verse 40, they've all committed themselves to the God that they worship. And then when you go through the rest of the chapter, 41 to 44, you find that they all escape, as it says in verse 44, they escaped all safe to land. So we know that a change happens from verse 35 to verse 40, and I'm going to say to the next chapter, verse 1. So they accept Paul's prayer, Paul's worship for them. He's their priest, if you like. When it's every person for themselves, they revert back to worshiping their own God. They commit themselves to their God of the sea. They all arrive safely. And what do they do now when they're on the beach? Verse 1. They do what all of us do. When you're in a difficult situation, you follow the crowd. Fast brain, you panic. And then when you come to your senses, you revert back to your old habits, to your slow brain. But by the time they get to the beach, verse 1, they all go to their established gods, their normal worship style. So I want us to consider that as we study the God of the sea, how people relate to God in times of crisis and in times of safety or relief. And what these things mean to us. So I just want to close with a passage from the Spirit of Prophecy. And then we'll close the study. So I'll post this on the Zoom forum because it may not be available in your various languages. It's a Spirit of Prophecy quote. Let me see if I can get the title. Yeah, it's called Sketches from the Life of Paul. The coding is LP, Life of Paul. It's page 270. When the roll was called, not one was missing. That's a paraphrase of Acts 27, verse 44. So the record is taken and no one's missing. Nearly 300 souls, sailors, soldiers, passengers, and prisoners stood, or sorry, prisoners, stood that stormy November morning upon the shore of the island of, it says Melita there, but it's Malta. That's what we call it today. So she gives you the literal number and the literal makeup of that number. And I want to remind us that when we look at this story, we look at none of their real roles in life. We just look at the number, nearly 300, 276. There were some that joined with Paul and his, it says brethren, but the people who were with him, his companions, in giving thanks to God. Which God? The God who had preserved their lives, the God of the sea, and had brought them safe to land through the perils of the great deep. The great deep means the sea. Now, you all know that what you're able to do from a statement like this when it says 300, when it says Paul and his companions, when it says that those three with some others pray to the true God of the sea, in summary, some of the 300 are praying to the true God of the sea. So therefore you can juxtapose the following argument, the following logic. If there's one group that is doing that activity, there's the other group that are doing the same activity, but there's a difference. Same prayer, same kingdom, same thanks, but the difference is it's a different God. And so this story, the story of Acts 27, besides all of what has been taught to us through the studies of Elder Tess the story of institutions, of boats, we know that it's also a story about gods. Gods who look and feel the same. Who have the same job function. Who are rulers over the same territory. Rulers over the sea. And I believe that there's a lot that we can learn from this. But not today. So, Lord willing, we may explore this further in the future. Let's close with prayer. Holy God, we thank you. As we consider this story of two groups, my hope and my prayer is that we feel uncomfortable, that we feel nervous, because we know that the priest in that story worships the true God, you. But we know in reality, in a different story about the end of the world, that there are two groups, two types of worshippers, all claiming to worship the God. The real God. And therefore we should be careful lest this story teaches us something about ourselves. That we might be found, even if we don't realize it, here at the end of the world, as we approach the Sunday law, worshipping the wrong God. Many of us were scared, frightened by the prophetic events that were all around us. Let us not be like that other group. That as we come to a place of relative safety, we go back to our old habits. We go back to worshipping our old gods. Save us from this fate. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.